Good evening, friends, and welcome to this event that is an opportunity for us to acknowledge and celebrate the centenary of the International Mission Council and its evolution into the Commission of World Mission and Evangelism. It is an opportunity for us to reflect on the contribution of the work of mission and the engagement in mission in the ecumenical movement. We felt it was important as the assembly gathered that there would be moments in the assembly to acknowledge this event and to have some conversation about the contribution of the mission engagement and the work of mission councils in the life of the ecumenical movement. My name is Michael Blair. I serve as the General Secretary of the United Church of Canada, and I am a member of the Commission on World Mission and Evangelism. And so on behalf of Risto and other members of the CME, it's my pleasure to welcome you to this event, and especially those of you who are joining us through Zoom. This is a two-part event. We will begin with a lecture, and following the lecture, we will have a short break in order for us to just change things around, and then we will have the book launch and panel discussion following that event. So welcome. It is our pleasure tonight to welcome Professor Brian Stanley. Brian is the professor at the University of Edinburgh in World Christianity. Brian has been the author of a number of books on Christian mission and its contribution. And so I invite Brian to take the podium and offer his lecture entitled Christian Nationalism, Race, and the Unity of the Church and Mission, Learning from the History of the International Mission Council, 1921 to 1961. Brian, welcome.
Well, thank you, Michael, for the kind introduction, and to all those responsible for inviting me. Good evening, everybody, to those here in Karlsruhe and those joining us throughout the world online. October 2021 marked the centenary of the formation of the International Missionary Council at Lake Mohonk in New York State. The IMC was one of the three principal forebears of the World Council of Churches, together with the Faith and Order and Life and Work movements, whose inception can be traced to two preparatory meetings held in Geneva in 1920. The IMC was the child of the Continuation Committee of the World Missionary Conference held in Edinburgh in 1910, and it was formed to embody the spirit of cooperation between Western mission agencies that marked the Edinburgh Conference. Now, the IMC lasted for only 40 years, being integrated within the World Council at the Delhi Assembly in 1961. Since its history was short, and since it symbolized the ascendancy of Western missions in the colonial age, you might well ask why we should bother to remember it. Surely the questions we face in the world church in our own day are the ones that should concern us. Well, I want to suggest in this brief address that some of the issues with which the IMC wrestled at different points in its history are still on our agenda today, even if the language we employ in discussing them may have changed. Now, they are not theological questions in the narrow sense, though ultimately they demand theological inquiry. The IMC, following a rule observed at the 1910 conference, was established with the proviso that it should avoid all theological questions that might divide its members. It had written into its founding constitution, no decision shall be sought from the council, and no statement shall be issued by it on any matter involving an ecclesiastical or doctrinal question on which the members of the council or the bodies constituting the council may differ among themselves. Whether that rule was scrupulously observed is another matter, but it should be borne in mind before we criticize the IMC for being insufficiently theological in its approach. The first question I want to discuss might surprise us. What place, if any, is there for nationalism in the world church? The founding meeting of the IMC at Lake Mahonk took place with the global disaster of the First World War still at the forefront of memory. The war had not only gravely fractured the human family, it had made far worse the problem of Christian disunity that the Edinburgh Conference had identified as one of the chief obstacles to the mission of the Church. It had painfully exposed the reality that the questions that separated Lutherans from Methodists or Presbyterians from Anglicans were as nothing compared to the gulf that separated Christians who found themselves on opposing sides of a conflict of nationalisms. For many of its leaders, the embryonic ecumenical movement that took shape during the 1920s was an affirmation of the supranational allegiance of all Christian people. In a world so recently torn apart by conflict between nations, the lordship of Christ over all humanity must transcend all other claims to loyalty. In their view, therefore, nationalism should be viewed with profound skepticism as a potentially anti-ecumenical force. But at the same time, as Western Christians were preoccupied with repairing the damage done to Christian witness by the sight of European Christian nations waging total war on each other, the churches in Asia were wrestling with a very different agenda. The 1920s was a decade in which Asian Christians, particularly in India and China, had to defend their faith as never before against charges that Christianity was a religion used by imperialists to dupe their fellow citizens into accepting European political or economic domination. How could they best defend their faith against such accusations? Well, the obvious solution was for Christians to demonstrate that their allegiance to their emergent nations was in no way inferior to that of Hindus, Muslims, Buddhists, Confucianists, or communists. For the educated national Christian leaders who spoke for the Asian churches in ecumenical gatherings in the early 20th century, nationalism was not an evil. On the contrary, with the infusion of Christian influence, nationalist politics offered the promise of freedom and a brighter future for the church. The first full meeting of the IMC after Lake Mahonk was held in Jerusalem in 1928. The conference took place on the Mount of Olives. Female delegates were housed in a Russian Orthodox convent, and the men in army barracks or even in tents. You don't know how lucky you are here in Karlsruhe. Here on the hillside, where Jesus prayed that all who believed in him might be one in faith and witness, gathered 231 representatives of Protestant mission bodies from 45 different nations. 52 delegates were from the non-Western world, an improvement on their meagre representation at Edinburgh in 1910. Yet, no indigenous Christian was invited to prepare a preliminary paper for the conference, and only 3 were invited to deliver one of the main addresses: Chung Ching-yi and Yuri Chang from China, and S.K. Datta from India. Chung Jingyi, General Secretary of the National Christian Council of China, delivered a sermon calling for a new vision of the Kingdom of God. Dr. Yuri Chang, chair of the same council, and S.K. Datta from India were both leaders of their national YMCA movements and gave addresses of a more political tone that reflected the current preoccupation of the YMCAs in China and India. Their priority was to enable their predominantly Western audience to understand the growth of radical nationalist sentiment among educated youth in their respective countries. Perhaps for the very reason that nationalism was such a contested matter, formally the Jerusalem meeting said rather little about it. Its focus was more on the challenge that secularism posed to the Christian faith. But the issue surfaced from time to time. One of the leading figures at Jerusalem was the Anglican Bishop of Manchester, William Temple, soon to become Archbishop of York, later of Canterbury. During the meeting, Temple delivered an evening address in which he asserted that it was better for China to have many denominations, all international, than a united Christian church, Chinese church, which was national only. He noted afterwards privately this had provoked the disagreement of the intensely nationalist Easterns. Wai Zumin, vice president of Central China Christian University, had collared Temple and his friend, the Christian socialist and economic historian R.H. Tawney, to insist that they must have national unity whether they had international connections or not. This observation elicited from Tawney, who was notorious for his sharp tongue, a response, "All you Orientals seem determined to go a European way to hell." Temple added in a letter to his wife, "This is horribly true." The American historian of the IMC, W. Ritchie Hogg, claimed that Jerusalem 1928 marked the beginning of a new era in relations between churches of sending and receiving countries. But in reality, voices from the receiving churches were only sporadically heard and not always understood. Was nationalism the European way to hell? Or was it the only basis on which the churches in challenging national contexts could build for the future? In this new age today of war in Europe and mounting international tension elsewhere, this remains a question that the ecumenical movement cannot evade, even if it defies a simple answer. The second question thrown up by the history of the IMC may also surprise us, not because we doubt its importance, but rather because we might wrongly suppose that Christians in the early 20th century did not perceive how pressing it was. It is this: what is a Christian view of race and racial justice? At Lake Mahonk, the infant IMC had asked its officers to undertake a study of the questions involved in racial relationships as they relate to missionary work. Earlier in 1921, its senior secretary, J.H. Oldham, had visited African American Christian communities and colleges in the US and caught from then a sense of the urgency of pursuing racial justice. He took up the challenge and in 1924 published his study, Christianity and the Race Problem. The primary thrust of his book was to emphasize the fundamental unity of humanity and the calling of the church to demonstrate in its own life and worship that in Christ there is neither Jew nor Gentile, bond nor free. Whatever natural differences, he said, may exist, they lose their significance in the oneness of the body of Christ. Take away this unity in Christ, he warned, and the heart falls out of Christianity. For Oldham, race was a theological issue, and he must take the credit for its prominence at Jerusalem in 1928. Remarkably, he wasn't there. He chose instead to accept an invitation from the British government to go to East Africa on behalf of the Royal Commission, investigating the possibility of closer union between British colonies there. Although he was absent from the Jerusalem meeting, his influence can be discerned in Volume 4 of the published record of the meeting, which was entirely devoted to the topic, the Christian mission in the light of race conflict. The titles of the 4 pre-circulated papers are revealing: The Negro in the United States of America, Agencies for Interracial Cooperation in the United States, Relations between the white and black races in South Africa, and Relations between the Occidental and Oriental peoples on the Pacific coast of North America. In marked contrast with Edinburgh 1910, the race issue in the US was treated as falling within the remit of Christian mission. No longer was mission defined simply as a geographical movement conveying the gospel from Western Christendom to non-Western heathendom. But what is striking is the lack of any address dealing with the question of race in relation to colonialism. Race relations in South Africa, like those in the US, were identified as an exceptional problem demanding Christian attention. But there was no mention of other parts of Africa, such as Kenya, Zimbabwe, or Malawi, where white settlers occupied disproportionate economic and political power. In discussion of the subject in sessions of the Council, there were occasional mentions of other parts of the world. Professor George Bacobo from the Philippines spoke of the demands of American capitalists aided by the American colonial government for more land for rubber cultivation, making the Philippines one of the sorest spots of the world. Harold Grimshaw, an economist employed by the League of Nations in Geneva, alluded to the destructive impact of white people on what he termed the primitive peoples of the Pacific. The Council statement on race did rather better. It highlighted 3 grave problems which still escape the salutary check of the international conscience. First, the relations between peoples of a metropolitan state and those of its colonies and dependencies. Second, the virtual hegemony exercised by one people over another as a result of the establishment of financial and economic control. And thirdly, the acquisition by the Western powers of special privileges, such as extraterritoriality in China. The statement contained numerous references to race without ever defining what it was. It declared the missionary enterprise to be an instrument of God for planting the church among all races. It asserted that the church had in its power to be the most creative force for worldwide interracial unity. In 2 places, the statement utilized the biblical theology of race that the Anglo-Catholic Bishop Charles Gore had incorporated into the Commission 3 report at Edinburgh 1910. There is little doubt that its wording came from William Temple, whose social theology was deeply indebted to Gore. Alluding to the vision of a New Jerusalem in Revelation 21, the statement affirmed that the different peoples are created by God to bring each its peculiar gift to the city, so that all may enhance its glory by the rich diversities of their varying contributions. Following Gore's example from 1910, the people's ethne of Revelation 21 was styled as races, and the statement looked forward to the fulfillment of the prayer of Christ that they may all be one in an eschaton when all races would bring their glory into the city of God. Now, the attempt of a Jerusalem meeting to address the race problem by reference to a Christian vision of unity in diversity is appealing, but the attempt was flawed. In 1928, as in our own day, the most frequent references to race were to peoples of African descent. Their continuing oppression, whether in South Africa or the US, took place in a society segregated by color, in which race seemed a self-evident category. But the Jerusalem meeting also applied racial language to the rapid influx of Chinese and Japanese immigrants to the Pacific coast of North America. A pre-circulated paper on this subject, written by Galen Fisher, close associate of John Mott, referred to these Chinese and Japanese immigrants as Orientals, an immigrant race. Fisher did not hesitate to enumerate some of the supposed weaknesses of the race in order to throw into relief the difficulties with which both Oriental and white promoters of goodwill must contend. The Japanese and Chinese delegates would not have welcomed such obliteration of their national identities by the blanket category of Oriental, though no protest from them is recorded. It is hard to imagine the language of the Oriental race being employed in any ecumenical forum today. The Jerusalem report also noted that the African members of the Council made a profound impression because of their moderation, humility, and wisdom, and implied that the wording of the statement on race owed a debt to their contributions. Yet an indigenous African was quoted only twice in the report. Professor D.D.T. Jabavu, a notable South African educationalist, social gospeler, and nationalist politician, had condemned racial segregation in his country and observed that many professing Christians are not treating black people as being possessed of a full personality. Race is not a biological reality. It's a social construct that fits some contexts better than others. Race discourse has survived into our own day, but only selectively. It's still common as a defining category of identity among African, African American, and Afro-Caribbean peoples, but it's rather less frequently employed in Asian, Latin American, or Oceanic contexts. It is significant that no subsequent IMC meeting made such wide use of the vocabulary of race. The Tambran meeting in 1938 in South India said little about race, though much about anti-Semitism. Race in its wider application did not feature again so prominently in conciliar ecumenical discourse until after integration in 1961, as the civil rights movement in the US reached its height. Questions of racial identity and racial justice were, therefore, a central concern in the early years of the IMC, even though there was an inadequate linkage between race and colonialism. We would wish to applaud Oldham's insistence that within the body of Christ, racial divisions dissolve into the new humanity that Christ has inaugurated. But would we be prepared to speak, as Gore and Temple did, of different races, each bringing their own racial qualities into the New Jerusalem? Peoples, probably yes. Races, maybe not. Few, if any of us, would be willing to follow Galen Fisher in speaking of an Oriental race, possessing its own racial peculiarities. And as for the language of a white race, that rightly sends a shiver down the spine. We are more comfortable with the vocabulary of a black race because we are conscious of the common history of enslavement and oppression at white hands that people of African descent share. It also reflects the fact that since the late 19th century, there has been a positive ideology of black racial identity, much of it shaped or endorsed by Christian apostles of Ethiopianism. No parallel ideology of Pan-Asian racial identity ever emerged or found Christian theological expression. To my mind, these apparent inconsistencies point towards the need for ecumenical discourse to attempt a truly global conversation about the theology of race. Until that happens, the Christian response to racism is likely to be fragmentary and confused. Our third and final question takes us to the heart of the relationship between mission and ecumenism. To what extent does the mission of the Church require its visible unity? The IMC had been formed to give embodiment to the conviction that the mission to the world, which Christ had entrusted to the Church, could not afford the luxury of fragmentation on national or denominational lines. Its rationale was to promote closer cooperation between mission agencies and between those agencies and the national representative councils of churches which evolved from their work. So the original membership of the council comprised not churches, but national cooperative bodies representing Protestant missions from Western countries, plus the National Missionary Council of India, Burma, and Ceylon, and 2 national branches of the Edinburgh Continuation Committee established in China and Japan. Just as representation at Edinburgh was not ecclesial in character, so membership of the council to which it gave rise was not on an ecclesial basis either. But as the national missionary councils formed after 1910 evolved into national Christian councils, and as these multiplied, the nature and status of IMC membership began to shift. By the 4th meeting of the IMC held at Villingen in Germany in 1952, it included 17 national Christian councils, but some of these were still represented in part or even in whole by Western missionaries. Furthermore, large parts of the world where the church was growing significantly, such as the Caribbean and much of sub-Saharan Africa, had no official representation at all. Of 187 persons present at Villingen, only 37 were non-Western nationals. Of the Secretariat of the IMC, only 1 of the 6 in 1952 was not a Westerner, the Indian Lutheran Bishop Raja Manikam, who became East Asia Secretary of the IMC and the WC together in April 1951. These statistics help us to understand the growing sense that the IMC was no longer an adequate forum for corporate reflection on the world mission of the churches. Even before the WCC was formed, one of the senior secretaries of the IMC, Norman Goodall, had floated the idea that the IMC should be renamed as the Missionary Council of the World Council of Churches. Happily, this was not adopted. And after 1948, the IMC was formally declared to be in association with the WCC and vice versa. And in 1954, Goodall was made secretary of a joint committee of the 2 bodies, and part of their brief was to consider full integration. By December 1957, when the IMC gathered at Achimota in newly independent Ghana, the momentum towards integration was unstoppable. However, we should take note of the arguments of those who opposed the move and the identity of those who advanced them. Historians have paid most attention to Canon Max Warren, General Secretary of the Church Missionary Society, CMS, perhaps the most far-sighted of all Western missionary leaders at the time. In a 30-minute address to the Assembly in January 1958, Warren conceded that integration now looked inevitable and readily agreed that mission and unity belonged together in the eschatological purposes of God. Yet, he maintained that both the witness of history and the evidence of current experience disprove the claim that mission could not be promoted without unity. Warren referred to a conversation he'd had recently with CMS missionaries at Ibadan in Nigeria, who told him of a rapid expansion throughout the country of what he termed the Pentecostal sects. Although the missionaries disagreed with much that was being said and done by the Pentecostals, the fact remained that they were bringing men and women to Christ, and in that they rejoiced. Their churches were innumerable, yet, observed Warren, they were not conspicuous advocates of the unity of the church. He had discerned a reality that is more obvious today, namely that the church in Africa, not to speak of other continents, was both growing rapidly and becoming increasingly diverse in institutional terms and theological terms. Africa, which had been seriously underrepresented in the IMC from the beginning, was now highlighting the truism that the membership of neither the IMC nor the WCC was coextensive with the body of Christ, even in its Protestant manifestations. Warren went on to allude to the profound suspicions of the World Council, which could be found especially in tropical Africa, where churches were growing that had only tenuous links with either the WCC or the national Christian or mission councils, if they existed. In an article in the IRM, Goodall attributed such suspicions to the influence of conservative evangelical missions from the US and Scandinavia. Warren took the view that the fears were not so much theological as rooted in the profound distrust of mammoth organizations. In reality, it's hard to separate the two grounds of concern. As a leader of a voluntary missionary society, which in its early years had minimal support from the Anglican bishops, he was voicing his own fears that large ecclesiastical institutions were unlikely to give rise to dynamic initiatives in mission. When one reviews the speeches delivered during the Council's debate on integration, a geographical pattern emerges. Alfred Stanley, Australian Anglican Bishop of Central Tanganyika, observed accurately that Asia, in contrast to Africa, is practically speaking with one voice in favour of integration. Both national Christians and missionaries viewed it as necessary to Christian witness in nations where Christianity was a small minority religion. In contrast, most voices from Africa or Latin America were either qualified in their support or opposed on principle. In part, this reflected the slower progress towards devolution made in these continents in comparison with Asia, and the preponderance of theologically conservative missionaries. Of the two African speakers to the debate, one, Francis Ibiam from Nigeria, opposed integration. The other, the South African Methodist minister, Zedar Mahabane, former President General of the African National Congress, was in favour. Several speakers voiced the fear that integration could provoke conservatives to form a rival African Christian council. Evidence was supplied from 5 African nations to the effect that ecumenical cooperation was strong at local level and gradually becoming a reality at national level, but all this could be imperiled if national Christian councils were required to affiliate with the World Council. In Africa, only 5 out of 15 national mission councils were affiliated to the IMC. The voice of African church leaders was rarely heard in the Assembly, though the missionaries who spoke for African opinion were in no doubt that it was resistant to integration. Latin American church leaders who spoke were also skeptical. The Mexican Methodist, Gonzalo Baez Camargo, informed the Assembly that in most of Latin America, Protestants were not prepared to listen to the case for integration, whilst Alfonso Rodriguez of the Cuban Council of Churches warned that we in Cuba, as in many Latin American countries, will have to pay a very high price for integration. The Evangelical Confederation in Brazil would also soon vote against integration. The Assembly eventually approved a complex resolution to move in principle towards integration by a vote of 58-7 with 9 abstentions. On the final day of the Assembly, Christian Baeta, a Ghanaian Presbyterian minister and academic who acted as chaplain and vice chair of the Assembly, moved a resolution. It proposed that the IMC should set up an inquiry charged with improving the relations between those missions, churches, and Christian councils in Africa that had links to the IMC or WCC and those that had not, and to consider the effect on these relations of any future merger of the IMC and the World Council. Dr. Baeta became the last chairperson of the IMC, presiding over integration in New Delhi in 1961. The process of integration was not without its casualties. the Congo Protestant Council and the Norwegian Missionary Council resigned their membership before integration took place. The fact that there were only two owes much to Baeta and perhaps even more to Leslie Newbigin, whom the Assembly appointed in his absence as chair of the IMC. In fact, he was soon to become its new General Secretary. Newbigin, although a strong supporter of the principle driving integration, had developed firm sympathies with those who worried that integration would lessen missionary zeal. And he spent much of his time in 1960 to 1961 visiting church and mission leaders in Africa, Latin America, and the Pacific, not simply because he had no previous experience of those continents, but also because these were the regions of the global south where doubts about integration were most serious. Max Warren's contribution to the debate about integration presents us with an awkward question. Does the history of Christian mission actually support the theological claim that mission will be most compelling when conducted by churches which tend to prioritize unity rather than by voluntary agencies which tend to prioritize evangelism over unity? But the debate also illuminated a pattern in the distribution of global Protestantism that has become more pronounced with the passing of the years. The growth of Pentecostalism, which came to Warren's attention on his visit to Nigeria in 1957, has since become an explosion, not simply in Africa, but also in Latin America and in much of Asia as well. If the IMC from 1957 to 1961 found it difficult to speak on behalf of the whole range of African and Latin American Protestants in its desire to integrate with the WCC, it is today even more difficult for the WCC to function as a representative body for the multiple strands of global non-Roman Christianity, and the difficulty now applies to Asia as well, to an extent that did not apply in 1957 to 8. How important is it that the visible unity of the church should be a reality, both at local level, as most of those who spoke for Africa at the 1957 Assembly maintained, but also at the level of national politics, as almost every representative from Asia claimed? And how should conciliar ecumenism approach those large and vibrant sectors of the world Christian movement whose mission is conducted without much attention to the World Council or to national ecumenical bodies, or even to the priority of visible unity? To sum up, I've suggested that the short history of the IMC raises three challenges of abiding relevance to the Church and its mission today, although they were not all equally prominent at every point of that history. The IMC was established with the proviso that it should not discuss divisive theology, but it rapidly became apparent that deep reflection on Christian mission was impossible without theological inquiry. I've highlighted three areas in which such inquiry was to an incomplete extent attempted at different points between 1921 and 1961. They all remain pertinent today. First, should the ecumenical movement give renewed attention to the fact that nationalism may be a more serious threat to united Christian witness than the historic issues of faith and order that still divide Christian traditions? Second, are the churches prepared not simply to oppose the continuing scandal of racial injustice, but also to attempt a distinctively Christian interrogation of what to me is a problematic and unstable concept, race? Finally, what forms of national, regional, and international Christian cooperation and mission are most appropriate for our own day, in which patterns of Christian affiliation are so much more diverse, complex, and fluid than they were in 1921 or even in 1961. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Brian, for that helpful and insightful, as it also identifies for us some of the continual challenge. We have a few moments now for some questions. We invite questions either from those of you who are present in the room or those of you who are joining us online, and we'll take a few moments to entertain any questions that you may have.
Chair, thank you very much. Yeah, just to maybe get things started. Brian, you mentioned in the introduction that in the constitution of the IMC there was a self-imposed restriction that there would be no theological discussion or decisions about matters on doctrinal or ecclesial matters on which the members themselves were divided. If you assess the 40 years of the IMC, I mean, how much did that hold it back theologically? Or how much, in terms of pursuing and articulating a theology of mission, did it find that there was actually quite a big space for doing theology without getting into the issues that had been placed off limits? I suppose a simple way of putting the question is, what was the contribution of the IMC to the theology of mission?
Thank you, Ken. Yeah, excellent question. I mean, maybe I should explain that the limitation on discussing any matter of faith and order was a concession made by Oldham and the architects of the Edinburgh 1910 conference to buy the participation of Anglo-Catholic members, particularly bishops, in the conference. We have to remember how extremely hesitant those who identified themselves as Catholics within the Anglican Communion were about identification with bodies which they didn't really regard as churches. They regarded as nonconformist sects. And at one point in planning the Edinburgh Conference, it looked as if the whole thing was going to collapse, simply because they'd included in the statistics Protestant missions in Latin America, and so, which was Christendom, and therefore shouldn't be included in a conference about taking the gospel from heathendom, from Christendom to heathendom. So that acute sensitivity to Anglo-Catholic sentiments was still there in 1921. The 1920s were the heyday of the Anglo-Catholic Party in the Anglican Communion, far more powerful than they are today. If you were going to have the Church of England on board, you had to conciliate the Anglo-Catholics. I think in practice, as perhaps you're hinting, Ken, I think the limitation was quietly forgotten. And I've never actually seen anybody saying, oh, hang on, we're disagreeing on a theological matter here, we're not allowed to do this. And maybe because Oldham wasn't there. I mean, Oldham organised one big conference, the Edinburgh 1910 conference, and I think basically concluded, I'm never going to do another one. I can understand it. He became quite sceptical about the value of big Christian assemblies. And so I think he found a reason to absent himself from Jerusalem in 1928, and by his later years he was more involved in other issues. So I think in practice the IMC did make a reasonable attempt at constructing theologies of mission, and that limitation was gradually sort of pushed to the margins.
From Finnish Evangelical Lutheran Mission. And first I want to thank you for a very good presentation. It was very interesting. With the background of the IMC not discussing theology, I have myself been reading on what happened when our then director prepared for the meeting in Jerusalem, and to me it seems that there was quite a lot of theology going on still. And you have concentrated quite a lot on the Anglo-Saxon view, but my impression was that there was quite a big debate on what mission was between the German-speaking world and the Anglo-Saxon-speaking world. How much should the mission be socially involved, and how much should it be concentrating, preaching the gospel, and it even caused a row in the preparations in Finland for going to that, and coming to the theme on nationalism, and how much did these different blocks then play in and shape the missiology forward?
Thank you. Yes, I mean, if there was a fundamental theological division at Edinburgh in 1910 and at Jerusalem, perhaps even more at Jerusalem in 1928, it was between a fairly confident, perhaps rather superficial social gospel Protestantism from North America, and particularly a sort of deeply Lutheran reflective theological approach to mission, which was still much more ecclesial in its concerns. And that was why Warneck was always, Gustav Warneck was very suspicious of the Mott slogan, the evangelization of the world in this generation, which in fact was hardly cited at Edinburgh in 1910. It had already been sort of torpedoed by continental Lutheran critiques that this was taking a sort of human goal and superimposing it on a divine program for the world. So that still remains an issue, but I think it's perhaps moderated by the common concerns of secularism, which are beginning to dominate the agenda. And as I said, most of the literature on the Jerusalem Conference actually concentrates on that. I chose to focus on the race issue because of its contemporary resonance and importance, because hardly anybody has written about it. I think it needs to be recognized. There's a fat volume there on Christian mission and racial justice. Thank you. Was the one over here first? Michael, no, come on. Yeah.
Thank you, Brian, for this lecture. And I would like to come back to Ken's question in a different way. You were highlighting in your book in Edinburgh that actually at that time in 1910, they planned to found mission on scientific research.
Yeah.
And I remember that in the continuation committee, they started to found these research commissions. So I wonder, how would you characterize this kind of studies that you were reciting? Okay. Was it a theological study? Was it a kind of an academic science? So, and how does that relate to that part of the IMC being a research council? Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. I mean, one example, Galen Fisher, whom I quoted, was director of something called the Social and Economic Research Council or something like that in the US, which was a Protestant body set up to coordinate reflection on social and economic matters. There was a tremendous enthusiasm to form links with sociologists, economists, anthropologists. R.H. Tawney is a good example, economic historian, famous today for his thesis on religion and the rise of capitalism, that he is a left-wing social figure who could say such dreadful things about the Orientals, was one example of trying to bring in the voice of an economist. There was a man from the International Labour Office in Geneva also brought in. You bring in as many secular experts that happen to be Christian, but they're working in secular environments. I mean, another example is the big report on Christian mass movements in India, which is published by the American Methodist Bishop John Ruscombe Pickett in 1929? The actual date has escaped me, but it's one of the first real attempts to use the sort of methodology we see in the World Christian Encyclopedia and in the Centre at Gordon Conwell, to apply that sort of methodology to mission. So, he's charting all the Dalits who are becoming Christian and what the reasons are which they give for their becoming Christian, and you do charts and graphs and you extrapolate that. It's scientific. But it doesn't actually interpenetrate with theology. And I think that's actually still the problem of an approach to world Christianity that majors purely on the statistical and charting trends without sometimes interrogating what lies behind the statistics. Yeah.
So we're done. Sorry. In the interest of time, and we have a short time, I want to say a big thank you again, Brian, for your presentation this evening and for the intersections that you have kind of brought from the work of IMC into our current reality, and lots of conversations need to continue. So thank you very much.
Thank you.